Welcome to the weekly Canadian Gender Wars Report. My name is Shannon Beauchesne, coming to you from Ottawa. You can find me at Shannon B. Douglas on Twitter, or formerly Twitter, now X, if you're looking for coordinates. And you can also reach out to me by email at shannon@chasingquicksilver.com. I've got an exciting episode for you today. Someone reached out to us this week, a viewer from inside the Toronto corrections system, a person who has knowledge of just how messed up the self-identification and transgender ideology and impact is within the prison system. I'm looking forward to chatting with Heather Mason about this because we have a lot of details to come from the men's side of the prison in the coming weeks as we unpack some of that. So just like with the trans affirming toolkit that a viewer introduced us to or gave us wind of back at the end of November, trans affirming toolkit for Ontario teachers. This going to provide an interesting insight into what's going on with gender self-identification in the prison system. There is an image I can't get out of my head. There's lots of notes I took from my conversation with this anonymous individual, but there was a courtroom a situation a while back where someone was being sentenced, and he dropped his pants in the courtroom and tucked his junk between his legs and said, "But I'm a woman, Your Honor." And it just shows how easily manipulated the system is. What I came to understand about the Toronto prison system is that it's very crowded. There are typically 3 inmates to a two-person cell. There are 2 bunks and 1 person sleeps on the floor. But the trans-identified cohort of men have such a well-established reputation for sexual assault and sexual violence that when they declare self-ID, they get put in segregated spaces like a solitary cell. So inmates have all figured this out, that if you declare that you are transgender, you can end up having your own cell instead of having to share it with 2 other dudes. Anyhow, lots more to come on that. This week, some big news from Europe. I often start from the global perspective, the big picture. And I'm undertaking efforts to communicate with CHEO, the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. The CEO is Alex Munter. Alex Munter is a former city councillor of Ottawa. And the board of directors, as well as the directors of education for the Ottawa Catholic School Board and the Ottawa Public School Board about gender identity. And my proposition is shut the clinic down at Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. I want the gender clinic condemned. I want it closed. And so I've been writing letters, started at the top with the directors and the CEO, and I'm working my way through the board of directors. And as that's been happening, one of the things I've said to them is a timeline of changes in Europe, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the UK, all of these rollbacks on prescriptions of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And in France, they're talking about criminalizing the prescription of puberty blockers for children. In Italy, they're talking about investigating a gender clinic for prescribing these. There was a bizarre story about basically an amateur castrator in the UK sentenced to 22 years in prison for filming extreme body modification and amputation So lots of stuff is going on, and we got news this week that the tide that has swept most of Europe has now found shores, let's call it, in Germany. The Medical Association of Germany, we get this from Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine. First resolution, 128th German Medical Assembly 2024 passed 2 resolutions to restrict puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries for gender dysphoric youth under 18 to controlled clinical trials. and to restrict self-ID laws to those over 18. Now, this was expected a couple of weeks ago, but has just come to the surface now. The first resolution focuses on gender-affirming care for youth. The resolution, upvoted by the majority of the physician delegates, stated, calls on the federal government to only permit puberty blockers, sex change hormone therapies, and gender reassignment surgery in under 18s with gender incongruence or gender dysphoria in the context of controlled scientific studies and with the involvement of a multidisciplinary team and a clinical ethics committee, and after medical and in particular psychiatric diagnosis and treatment of any mental health disorders that are not gender dysphoria. The therapy results of any intervention of this kind must be followed up sociologically, medically, child and adolescent psychiatrically, socially, and psychologically over a period of at least 10 years, and the evaluation results incorporated into the revision of the guidelines on gender incongruence and gender dysphoria in childhood and adolescence. This is really big news from Germany. Verifiable groups. On one hand, there was a political group, and it looked like Germany was going down the legislative pathway that has created and reinforced and accelerated this kind of toxic ideology of gender identity. So the activists are still trying to push through legislation, but parallel to that, the doctors have got involved now and say, whoa, we're recommending to the government that this only be done in clinical trials and with a proper fulsome assessment. This is very much reflective of the work of the Cass report and Dr. Hilary Cass. Hilary Cass was on the National Public Radio, NPR, in the United States this past week, the first American interview. And I was very surprised by how thorough the interviewer was with Dr. Cass. And I was also surprised because the NPR, I saw something like 83 out of 84 people who are editors with the National Public Radio in the U.S. are Democrats. There's just it's all left wing, and they've got themselves in hot water in the last few weeks for having the former head of Wikipedia talking about like alternative facts and basically propaganda in the name of service to society. So NPR's covered this in the United States. We've got this big change in Germany that kind of completes the set, right? Like France, Germany, the UK, the three big powerhouse countries in Europe, plus the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Finland. The Dutch protocols are being reevaluated, and we're seeing a tremendous shift over the pond. Now, so I've been writing to the head of CHEO, Alex Munter, saying the time's up. There's no longer any excuse for the hospital to be pushing gender-affirming care. They're seeing 400 to 500 kids a year at the CHEO hospital. And I have a lot of love and respect for that, and as does much of the Ottawa community, for the hospital itself and the work that it does for kids. But this gender services department that is running the accelerated transition and affirmation protocols on kids here has not caught wind of the changes that are happening overseas. So I have said in my communications that you're on notice. Now that the Cass review is out, you don't have a choice. And failing notification that the science is out on this issue and that the protocols that are being followed at the gender clinic are driven by ideology worse than the Tavistock Gender Clinic means that the CEO of the hospital and perhaps even some of the members of the board, the chief of staff, the chief medical officer for the hospital are going to be in positions where they're going to have to resign. They're going to have to resign if they fail to take notice and take action about the Cass report, or they're going to have to resign because they stood up, they found their spines, and they shut down the damn clinic, and then the activists went after them. Either way, they're going to have to resign. One way is more disgraceful than the other. Now, the activists in Canada are ramping up for June and have started to colonize May now. Egal Canada, which originally stood for Equality for Gays and Lesbians Everywhere, is ramping up their marketing efforts. This week, they're offering a basically safe navigation of LGBTQI events, a webinar for event organizers navigating hate at events. And so that's coming up this week. I'm gonna tune in under a pseudonym to see what it is they're actually saying. EGAL is putting out a communication strategy for activists, and Faye Johnstone of Queer Momentum is making the rounds on media, running a series of protests across the country this coming week to try and establish, they've created this straw man. They've created this fake enemy of LGBTQ hate, and are lathering, whipping their followers and their cult members up into a lather over this. And we'll just see how many people choose to stand up at this point. It's getting harder and harder to talk about this stuff for these activists anywhere. Now, even in Nova Scotia, as a matter of fact, there was a big article that came out in the last couple of days in Nova Scotia. Let me just pull it up. In the Saltwire. Now, the Saltwire is connected to a paper published out of Halifax. A long article. It says 17-minute read. UK reversal of hormone therapy. Puberty blockers for youth call Nova Scotia rules into question. Now, I happen to know that Dr. Hilary Cass, the author of the Cass report, met with the Nova Scotia health minister in the last 18 months and provided insight and information from the work that had been done up until that point with the Cass review. And even still, the Nova Scotia Health Ministry was celebrating the opening of a new gender clinic in Nova Scotia just in the last couple of weeks. Well, now that we've got a major paper putting a big front page story, long, it's 3 newspaper pages long. They deserve very much better is the image quote. Of course, they point to Hilary Cass. So this is a very interesting development in New Brunswick. We have another paper breaking stride with the hegemony, or breaking away from the hegemony of the Rainbow Mafia and the Alphabet people, to talk critically about the evidence that is lacking and severely lacking behind the affirmation model in schools and the affirmation model in medicine for children. So big news there. Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the most cited think tank in Canada, nonpartisan think tank, put up a piece by my friend and friend of the show, James Pugh. James is the founder of Woke Watch Canada, which is a Substack that publishes quite a volume of work. James is doing a tremendous work gathering great writers together to talk about some of these culture war issues in Canada. He is one of the authors of Grave Error, a book that's covered some of the distorted narrative and the distorted the lies that Canadians are accepting about residential schools and so-called mass graves. I won't get into that too much. It is a let's call it a pet issue of mine. And I feel a very deep sense of connection to the plight of Indigenous people in Canada. There were serious issues in the residential schools, and I've heard many stories from individuals, including numerous ones that attended the Kamloops Indian Residential School, about the kind of abuse that they went through there. So James is working to get the story straight. He's done some great work, and Macdonald Lurie Institute put up his piece. It's called Canada's Dangerous Commitment to Trans-Affirming Care for Minors. He talks a bit about that trans-affirming toolkit for Ontario teachers and various other breakthroughs, the WPATH files. CSIS, Canadian Security Intelligence Service, released a report. The CSIS Public Report 2023, Security Intelligence Services acknowledges. There's the land acknowledgement. Sorry, we don't need to go through that. They published a report this week and named anti-LGBTQ parents as potential threats of violence in Canada. It sounds scarier than it is. They did recognize that there are religious and cultural groups in Canada that let's say a quicker trigger finger on violent behavior, and that this is a possible threat to Canadians in terms of security and violence. Interestingly, there was no mention of Diagolon, the fictitious group made up by Justin Trudeau to try and associate with Pierre Poilievre, and so we're working through some fictions and getting to reality. What else do we have? There's a report that just came out in draft. The Health Draft Quality Standards for Gender Affirming Care for Gender Diverse People, adults. Health Quality Ontario is an Ontario provincial government body with the stated purpose: we believe that everyone deserves better health and excellent quality care. And they have created a draft framework for gender affirming care for adults. It's in the feedback mode right now. So there's some work being done on this. But this started a couple of years ago. A lot of the contributors are activists. We can kind of expect that it's going to be activist leaning on this and ideologically leaning rather than scientifically leaning. We have Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, the JCCF, who I make a regular financial contribution to. They've been supporting Amy Ham for the last several years, and I've done an awful lot of great work with the convoy and freedom of expression and protecting those who have been canceled in Canada and unjustly bullied out of their employment or defamed. John Carpay is the head of that organization. He writes in the Western Standard about New Brunswick trying to, the activists fighting to protect Bill 713, which is the Keep Secrets from Parents bill, or set of policies that Premier Blaine Higgs is pushing back against. The CCLA claims that New Brunswick's parental consent policy violates the rights and freedoms of gender diverse students under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Now, this is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. They have been fully captured by woke ideology. And Carpay says, children do not enjoy privacy rights vis-a-vis their own parents. They're not adults and therefore have no right to vote in elections, drive a car, get married, have sex with an adult, join the military, purchase liquor, consume cannabis, and claiming children have the right. Adult rights is a perversion of the Charter, not a Charter right. While children do not enjoy adult rights and freedoms, children are entitled to the love, support, and guidance and nurturing of their own parents. Parents are severely hindered in providing these necessities to their children when parents are kept in the dark about what's going on with their own children at school. If we require parents to get parental consent for a child to go on a half-day field trip to the Science Center, then surely parental consent should be required for the child to use an opposite-sex name, pronoun, clothing, change rooms, etc. while at school. So JCCF, not the first time they've weighed in on this issue, has published a great piece in the Western Standard. So I'm going to share with you the letter that I have sent to, this is the Chief of Staff for CHEO. I've modified a couple of letters or some sections of content that I'm cutting and pasting that I'm sending strategically to key people within CHEO. I'm going to be doing that for a couple of weeks. I have let them know that I'm going to be reaching out to media. Things like the Saltwire article in Nova Scotia and the James Pugh's publication and the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. In fact, the president of the MLI made a statement about gender identity and overstepping along with the article this week. So a lot of great things are moving along, but these people in the institutions are stuck, right? They're either in ideologically captured and ideologically rigid environments where they still feel they can't speak up, and they're going to have to, or they're the true believers. So we have to kind of dislodge and shift these people, make them uncomfortable enough that they're going to have to take some action. So I started with Alex Munther, the CEO. I've written to a couple of the board members of the CHEO hospital this week. I'm going to be strategically writing to a couple of more, and then targeting some of the key executive at CHEO with this information. It's basically an email stamp that I've sent to them that we can point back to and say, look, you were told, you chose to ignore this information, and therefore you should resign. And I expect perhaps that this will be also useful in lawsuits, because after the CAST review was published, any child that's getting puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, when these bureaucrats and executives have been warned about this, adds to the level of responsibility reaching to malfeasance at a certain point. There's a point where this is willful, and it's willful ignorance that's causing severe harm to children. So my letter, Ms. Sampson, I'm notifying you of the release of a systematic evidence review commissioned by the National Health Service of the UK, the CAST review of April 2024, which raises questions about the continued operations of the CHEO Gender Clinic. I wrote recently to Alex Munther about this issue and the major changes around the world and how governments and healthcare systems are dealing with so-called trans kids. Attached is a timeline of countries who have reversed course on gender-affirming care and hormones based on reviews of evidence. Canada is a laggard globally on this, though some provinces have begun to change legislation. Munther has a history of blocking and ignoring communication about this issue and has recently signed condemnations on behalf of CHEO of Premier Daniel Smith for bringing evidence-based policy to Alberta. With recent international developments and scientific findings, CHEO is undeniably exposed to a massive public relations issue, a financial liability issue, and a reputational risk issue for the CHEO Foundation. We're beyond the point where anyone can say, I didn't know that there was a serious ethical problem and massive failures of the medical and mental health support systems when it comes to gender-affirming care for children. I'll summarize the CHEO issues. In 2013, CHEO Gender Clinic saw a handful of referrals for gender identity incongruence. In 2023, 10 years later, as I predicted from data from a couple of years ago, CHEO saw 400 to 500 referrals to the Gender Clinic, a 100 times increase in 10 years, or an 80% year-over-year growth rate. Even a CHEO endocrinologist was quoted in 2022 saying social and peer influence are partly responsible for the rise in kids seeking gender-affirming care. I use the term sex changes for impact. CHEO uses something called the affirmation model for children, which means when a child presents, they are not given therapy for body dysmorphia or trauma or anything else. They're given hormones or puberty blockers, often on a first appointment. Despite activist claims, this is not settled science. They are not reversible interventions, and they do not result in improved mental health or reduction of suicidal ideation. These claims have all been repeatedly examined and found to be unsupported by credible evidence. Two things have happened in the last 2 months that put CHEO in a position requiring immediate action. Emerging evidence shows unquestionably that gender-affirming care practices at CHEO Gender Clinic run counter to sound evidence and violate core principles of medical ethics. First, the WPATH files were released by journalists Maria Hughes and Michael Schellenberger on March the 6th, 2024. They exposed leaks that show that the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, known as WPATH, the organization that CHEO cites as their authority for supporting gender-affirming care, is a corrupt activist organization and not a health authority. Members advocate for and perform irreversible medical interventions for children who they know cannot understand or consent to these types of medical interventions. The former head of WPATH, Dr. Marcy Bowers, is on record as saying, boys whose puberty is truly blocked at Tanner stage 2 will be infertile and will never have an orgasm in their lives. It's really a devil's bargain. The evidence from the WPATH files demonstrates that they are self-identified, that they are a self-identified authority on gender-affirming care, which is run by activists and not scientists. The second thing that's happened, the CAST report 2024, a 4-year systematic evidence review by Britain's former head pediatrician. The systematic review is the highest level of scientific analysis of research. It assesses all available research on a subject, evaluates the quality and strength of evidence and claims, and then makes recommendations. The conclusion and recommendations resulted in massive changes in gender-affirming care in the UK. 2 years ago, the interim report by Hilary Cass led to the closure of the Tavistock GIDS Clinic, the world's largest pediatric gender clinic. Cass and the court system in the UK found that most children presenting with gender incongruence had moderate to severe autism and had other major mental health issues that went unaddressed. One mental health professional I know in Ottawa who left her institutional employer said, these are the same kids we used to see who were cutting themselves, who had anorexia and who had bulimia, the kids who didn't fit in. And now we have to affirm them without question or else we can lose our jobs because they call it a human rights violation. In the UK, the GIDS clinic was found to be overly influenced by activists and activist organizations and allowed a groupthink to create an environment where ideology was placed ahead of science and the first rule of medicine. There are now more than 1,000 families suing the National Health Service of the UK, and this should be a warning sign since Canada and CHEO are far more liberal and incautious than the Tavistock Clinic was. In Real World Canada, CBC Radio-Canada investigation did a hidden camera segment where a 14-year-old girl who stated a history of self-harm and eating disorder was counseled on having a radical double mastectomy, and which is top surgery, euphemistically, within 6 minutes of seeing a clinician, and prescribed opposite-sex hormones within 9 minutes. This is typical for Canada, according to organizations, trans activist organizations like Trans Youth Can, where we get much of this data. Everything I'm saying here is evidenced. I've been doing education policy and public policy analysis on the subject for more than 3 years because one of my children was referred to the CHEO Gender Clinic. I could go at great length, but I will say plainly, I believe the board must act immediately to understand the issue and take action. The only rational conclusion based on emerging evidence is that the gender clinic at CHEO must be shut down. On May 1st, I recommended to Mr. Munter that he appoint an independent task force to evaluate the CAST report so he could have a credible evaluation from objective doctors about CAS's findings and recommendations. He has not responded. I said quite plainly that this issue would likely result in his resignation. On one hand, changing policy at the gender clinic would result in activists attacking the hospital and Munter. On the other hand, failing to act on credible information and knowingly perpetrating harms to children as performed at the gender clinic would be a clear failure of his responsibilities and duties as Chief Executive Officer. I've also corrected the directors of education for both Ottawa's major school boards, which both have policies of secretly affirming children who claim to be the opposite sex, and whose teachers and counselors refer kids to the gender clinic without parental knowledge or consent. This is moving very rapidly and cannot be ignored. In 6 months, the public will be asking why leaders of institutions like CHEO didn't take these warnings seriously. I'm of the mind that it would be better for CHEO to establish itself as a leader in Canada rather than look like they were involved in cover-ups, in denials, in obfuscation, and in perpetuating the activist policies and practices. The second course will leave the hospital suffering lengthy and costly investigations and reputational damage that it will cause to their foundation. So that's the framework of letters that I've been sending. I would like to start a campaign, a more vocal one, to shut down the CHEO Gender Clinic. I think that we need some targeted focus. We need to see an institution like CHEO in Canada have a come to gender moment and have that splash on the pages of the Globe and Mail and across the digital banners of CBC Online. We can't keep telling ourselves these lies that is causing so much damage to children and families in Canada. And it's time for this to turn over. My prediction is that we will see, I say 6 months, I think a year from now, it will be just entirely unpalatable to be raising banners in the public education system in the month of June for Pride Month. There's no reason to be proud of where the alphabet mafia and the alphabet activists have taken gender identity ideology. It is something that we are going to be deeply, deeply ashamed of. That's where I'm going to leave it for this week. Make sure you like and subscribe. Thank you for watching through to the end. Share this with friends. And if you happen to be in a position in an institution, like my new friend in corrections in Toronto, feel free to reach out. I was trained in nonfiction writing in university in a department in creative writing that spun out to become the journalism school at University of British Columbia. So I went through a long form writing, research for long form writing, including interview technique and focus on the truth and protecting of confidential sources. So if you would like to break some news, please do reach out. You can find me again at Shannon B. Douglas on X, formerly Twitter. And you can email me, shannon@chasingquicksilver.com. That's the weekly Canadian Gender Wars report for this week. Next week, while I remember, we have the National Parent... Is that next week? 2 weeks from now. The 25th of May, the National Summit, our second effort. We're going to have a great group of speakers, including Maria Hughes, the author of the WPATH Files, who is a friend of the show. And we will have Nadine Ness from Saskatchewan, who's organizing school trustee candidates across the province. She's an expert in former RCMP expert in child predator tactics and the kinds of methods that they use to access children. She's been a great resource for Canadians in the last year and a half or so who have been looking at these issues and recognizing that our children are at risk. That's May 25th. Next weekend is a long weekend. We might pre-record something. And Melanie today is at the Rebel News event today is the 11th, Saturday, at the Rebel News event in Toronto. I saw her put up some pics with our friend Bruce Party, lawyer from Queens, as well as Conceptual James Lindsay. I missed going down there because it's Mother's Day tomorrow, and I wish you all a very happy Mother's Day and a great remainder to your weekend.